for two reasons. First, we had developed skills in technical construction to make our submarines quiet, undetectable by either audible or sonar listening devices. Secondly, if you recall, maybe you don't because you're not old enough, but a slip of the lip sinks a ship was one of the terms that was very popular back at that time. And so no one talks or knows, if there is no one who talks and knows where the submarines are at, we can operate more successfully and we will operate silently. One very ignorant World War II senator, trying to show off how much knowledge he had available, told the press that we, the silent service, were successful in escaping Japanese counterattack because they were not setting their depth charges deep enough and we were operating below the level that the depth charges were going off. That stupid remark got in the newspapers. The Japanese spies picked it up, and I tell you that cost us a lot of subs and a lot of men. Again, there was a U.S. Army pilot who sighted a sub returning to base in Key West, Florida, and he strafed and bombed the boat and sent the message, sighted sub, sank. That's stupid. That pilot, I tell you, was inexperienced, unskilled, and never lived another day in peace. A valuable ship and 70 men were wasted. Congress remained silent for 50 years, until in 1945, when at a ceremony in Groton, Connecticut, a wall of honor was dedicated to the over 3,600 submariners lost in World War II. At that time, we, the surviving subjects of that war, said no longer would we allow Hollywood to falsely portray submarine warfare. We would, to the best of our ability, tell what it was really like. And that is why you and I are here today. Some years ago, Roger Whittaker had a popular song with the words, "I have no fear of death, though death surrounds me." The song continues, and later it says that he was in battle at that time. I do not believe that. That is not right. In most cases, the fear of death heightens one's physical strength to deeds of valor. Fear of death increases one's mental acuity beyond normal. These increased abilities are the stuff that make heroes. Recently, I read in a novel by one of my favorite authors, Tom Clancy. You may remember he wrote the book, The Hunt for Red October. And in this new book, Hidden Forces, he says, and I quote, "If you don't feel fear, you can't be brave. Brave is when your bowels are like ice and you're terrified. But you go out and you do the job anyway. I don't want troopers who are fearless. They're the first ones to get taken out when the situation goes hot. Fearless and stupid go together." In battle, I feared death. But I fear death no longer. And you may ask me why? Why? This is my story. It's early January 1945. I had been a U.S. Navy submarine sailor since late 1943. Previously, I was attached to the USS Bashaw, SS-241, if I remember right. But now I was aboard another submarine called the USS Guavina, SS-362. We departed Fremantle Harbor, it was a sub base on the western coast of Australia. went out the Fremantle River to the Indian Ocean and followed up the shoreline on the Indian Ocean up to a place called Exmouth Gulf. And there was a huge tanker in there. And we topped off our fuel tanks with diesel oil. The crew went swimming. I'm not much of a swimmer, so I stood shark guard. I had a Thompson submachine gun, and many sharks came in, and I just fired over the top, and it was just like, you guys right up there? Of course, all you gotta do is hit a shark, and then there's mass feeding going on anyway. So we rested up there, and we were about 900 some miles from the Straits of Lombok. It's about 4.5 days. We programmed ourselves to arrive there at night with about 5 hours of continuing darkness before either there was moonrise or dawn, to make the run through the Straits of Lombok, which are about 50 miles long. On one side of those straits there's the island of Lombok, and on the other is Bali Bali, which became very famous in the Tales of South Pacific as Bali High. Both of those islands were Japanese held. They had artillery on both islands, and they had some submarine chasers that would give us some problems. Generally, we went through there just as fast as we could possibly go. There was an awful lot of noise going on, but none of it from us. They were just shooting at us, and we were just going like this to try to evade them, and we generally always made it. They only had one submarine that was hit in all the times going through that straits. We were headed for the Java Sea and deeper waters. Now, the islands of Lombok and Bali Bali are in the Indonesian archipelago, which starts way off to the east at the bottom of the Malaysian peninsula and cuts across between the South China Seas, the Java Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Japan does not have, and at that time and still now, does not have enough farmland to feed their own people. Much less at that time their armies in the far-off islands and lands that they had conquered since 1938. They also do not have any oil. In the Indonesian archipelago, Sumatra and some of the other islands, well, up north was Borneo, but over here was Java, they got all of the oil that they needed to produce their gasoline to run their war machine, and also to get food to feed their homeland people plus their troops out in the field. The submarine Navy's job was to prevent any of the ships carrying that material to reach the homeland, Japanese homeland. That stretch of water was 2,800 miles. We had one heck of a lot of submarines in that stretch. We sank ships there constantly. Our job, start them up. Don't give them any oil that they can fight with. A few days after we cleared the north end of the straits, we went into battle with 2 tankers and 2 destroyers. They were coming out of Borneo and traveling westward to get around the stretch of islands that we call the Philippines. And we happened to see them. We made a study of their zigzag procedure and determined that one of the legs was about 12 minutes long, and that if we could get a couple miles ahead of them, even in daylight, we could set ourselves up, and then on the 12-minute leg, we would be able to fire and hopefully sink one of the ships, or both. We did that, and we fired 3 torpedoes. You typically fire the first torpedo so that it goes right straight at the screws, so that you can, if you knock out their ability to proceed, you've got all the time in the world to kill them. And that's the name of the game. So the first torpedo goes at the screws, the first one goes, the second one goes just slightly ahead of the ship, the target, so that in case the target decides to speed up, having spotted you, you will have one going up, and the third one goes right at it. We made 2 hits. The ship rolled over and started to sink. They put out their lifeboats. We surfaced, and the entire sea was covered with gasoline. We were almost very sick. The aroma of, that's a very sweet odor, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline leaking out all over the sea. But Captain ordered the gunnery crews to man the 20mm guns, and also to bring up the 50 caliber, and we were just going to shoot the lifeboats. And we were prepared to do that when the gunnery officer said, "Stop." I think it was every 5th or 6th or 7th bullet. I don't know much about the guns, but there's a what do you call it? A tracer shell, okay? And they were afraid to put the whole sea on fire, and we would be trapped. So we let them go. War changes. If they had not been harassing our hospital ships, or if they hadn't been giving us a bad time, we probably wouldn't have bothered shooting them. But if they were giving us a bad time in the war, we gave them a bad time in the war. We'd shoot them wherever we possibly could. We proceeded on, and we cleared the island that's at the end of the Java Sea, and we were out into the South China Seas. This may be about a week later, 5 days. And we picked up another ship. It was a freighter-type ship with 2 escorts. And we made approaches on that ship 5 times. And those destroyer escorts were really hot. They were really good. They caught us every time. Coming in, we couldn't get close enough to make what we felt was a reasonable shot to kill them. And after we had failed, we backed off, and prior to that, meeting that vessel, we had some problems with our radar, and we had one night notified COMSUB PAC, which was located as a commander of Submarine Pacific, which was located in Pearl Harbor, that we needed some spare parts for the radar, and they arranged for us to make contact with another submarine that was working up a little further north towards Mindoro, and we met, and they had a spare part for us, and we got a radar fixed. And so when we were having all this trouble trying to get a decent approach on this freighter, we called COMSUB PAC, because we can't call the other submarine. We have to call headquarters, and told them that we had a small convoy, that we needed help. So they sent over this other sub, which was a Mapanita. We met about a day and a half or so later, and we made a quote-unquote 2-submarine wolf pack. The other submarine skipper was higher in rank than mine. My skipper's name was Ralph Lockwood. And so he hadn't sunk any vessels yet on this patrol. So therefore our patrol was already deemed successful. and his was not. So he said, you go in and pull off the escort, and I will go in and sink the freighter. My captain didn't think too much about that, but we thought, well, we'll give it a go. So we're on the surface, and we have the ability to pump air into our ballast tanks and get ourselves high up out of the water, so we have very little drag. In other words, when we reduce the amount of submarine that's pushing down into the water. We got up pretty high, and we went in right at the store, as if we were going to land, and we got a quarter of a mile on the ocean. Was like that far. But it's a quarter mile here, but on the ocean it looks like this, And we're nose right up this guy, and we're firing flares at him and attracting attention to pitch black at midnight, And we veered off, and we took off going across the ocean, and he took off after us. He has 3-inch cannons on that thing. And he was shooting at us, and we were zigzagging all over like that, and that went on for about maybe, 5 to 10 minutes, and then pow, that ship blew up. And it blew up for the entire rest of the night. That guy that was chasing us turned around and fled tail, and knowing that any Navy, that guy was no longer a captain. He was deckhand, because he had failed his mission, which was to protect that freighter. He had got fooled. He probably was swabbing decks now. So at that time, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. We had been in 2 battles. We had been successful twice. We hadn't even had a depth charge about us yet. We'd had a couple airplanes come by, but we dove and escaped. They didn't find us. So, what I'm saying is that we had faced and we had feared death, but we had won. We hit it again. We're heading west now. We're still about 1,500 miles from our final destination. We'd already traveled about 2,000 miles. Got about 1,500 miles more to go before we get to our final destination, which is off the coast of French Indochina. But on our way, there's a whole series of islands on the north side of the Indonesian archipelago where ships can go in, enemy ships. You have to understand that in my language, there are only 2 kinds of ships or boats in the world. They are submarines and targets. Anybody we see is a target. So we're going in and out of these islands, just snooping our way around, probably about 40 of them, looking for targets. And finally, we're now almost over to Singapore. We turned and started heading north. We're at what we call the south end of the Malaya Peninsula. We go up the east coast of Malaysia, across the Gulf of Siam, to the southern tip of Indochina. We went past the Mekong River Delta to an area just north of Saigon. I'm sure you all recognize and will recognize a lot of these names because they all became common usage due to the Vietnam War. Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City. South Indochina is now Vietnam. Our patrol area is from just north of Saigon, past Cam Ranh Bay, on up past Phan Rang to Patapon Cape, which is a little south of Da Nang, and the Hainan Island, which is at the Gulf of Tonkin. All of these areas of the world became very, very well known to people who were in the Vietnam War. We sighted shipping every day just after daybreak. sampans. You know, these are small wooden or thrush-made boats, and they were carrying grain. But there's nothing that we could do about them, I mean, other than harass them. They would be in groups of 200 or 500, and it was just not much we could do. Or there were some larger ships, but they were always too far out for us at that time. So we figured out that what these people were doing was traveling by day, where they could use their escort vessels to protect them, and being close to shore, they would be traveling only 2-3 miles offshore in literally what we would call shallow water. They had land-based aircraft to help protect themselves from the submarines. And believe me, we had a submarine every 40 miles for that 1,500-mile stretch, just waiting for them. And then at night, they would go into harbors and be protected because we couldn't get out. So we needed to catch them early as they left their harbor. So we waited submerged before dawn at battle stations. Our outer forward torpedo doors were open. We were off Cameron Bay. There was a large tanker and a small freighter with 3 escorts coming down the shore straight at us. One escort was traveling in front, one was in the rear, and one was on the sea side. They didn't need anything on the shore side because it was so shallow, no submarine would be able to get in there. They were coming right straight at us. So the lead destroyer cast directly overhead. You know, you can hear when you're submerged, you can hear audibly things that are happening on the surface above or within a half a mile of where you're at. And this lead destroyer passes boom, 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 boom. That's the screw going around, you know, like that. As soon as he went over us, the captain orders came quick. He said, make periscope depth. Up scope. Stand by forward. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Down scope. Elapsed time. Quartermaster answers. 20 seconds, sir. Time to the target. 10 more seconds, sir. The targets were very close. Our torpedoes traveled at a rate of about 60 miles an hour. They were less than half a mile away. There was one loud explosion, then another, and then a third. We had 3 hits out of the 4. And that's really very, very good shooting. The next commands came again very quickly. Up scope. The tanker is sinking. The freighter is listed. Exec, take a look. Confirm. The executive officer looks. He says, yes, sir. That tanker is on his, the tanker is sinking, and the freighter looks like it's still moving. Okay, down scope. All ahead full. Right full rudder. Take her down. Level off at 130 feet. Rudder midships. All ahead standard. Rig for silent running. Rig for depth charge. We were heading straight out to sea and to deeper water. We slipped very quietly now because we had rigged for silent running, and we could shut down all our lighting motor generators. There was nothing turning or moving in that submarine except the motors that drove the screws. Everything else had been shut off. No man moves. Everything remains perfectly quiet. You do not talk for any reason. We went under the outboard escort. The lead escort was already ahead of us. And we hit bottom. We hit bottom like a were still undetected, and there was a sandy or muddy soil, and the submarine just went shh and stopped. Captain says, all stop running engines. And at that point, we had knocked out all of our sonar, what we call the QB/QC heads, which are located in the forward torpedo loop. The tanker sank on the spot. The damaged small freighter was escorted away to safety by one of the destroyers. The other destroyers started pinging so they could find us. We could tell one ship from the other because they have different sounds. And we keep track of where they're at. That was one of my jobs on the plot, was to figure out where all these guys were at and where they were moving, and you could tell them. And how could we do that? Because we had a sound gear on the top deck. It was called JK, which was in the audible range. And we could hear audible sounds. The third destroyer, well, at that time, the one destroyer had escorted the freighter off, and we saw later that they beached it, tried to save it. But that third destroyer now returned, and they tried every trick that they could think of to make us create a sound. They would all be moving about, and suddenly they would all stop, and they'd listen to see if they could hear us. They couldn't find us, and so they started a haphazard depth charge attack. Our dive had hit bottom because we were using old Japanese charts, and they were not accurate. We hit before we could blow negative tank and achieve a neutral buoyancy position. We crashed at 129 feet, stuck in the mud. After 3 or 4 hours of depth charging, suddenly all was quiet. We waited patiently, not knowing what was going to happen. The pressure inside the boat was approaching 34 inches. Normal atmospheric pressure, today is probably about 30 out there, about 30 inches. The temperature, fear is felt all around. Your stomach is in knots. Your head hurts. You try to think, how are we going to escape? It is now past noon. We haven't eaten since the evening before, but I doubt if anyone was even thinking about it. We decide that the destroyers are taking turns to go back to Camaron Bay, which was also an aviation base at that time for the Japanese, to reload depth charges. 50 or more had been dropped on us, but none close enough to do any damage. They're all back now, and they start a calculated pattern of laying 7 charges. Pause, move a quarter mile up the coast, drop 7 more, in a line going from sea towards shore, from sea towards shore. We estimate that they had started to the south of us, and that in 2 hours they would reach us. In the meantime, we are overweight, and we need to blow negative tank with 3,000 pound air. 3,000 pound air makes a very high-pitched, audible squeal, detectable by the enemy. We open the valve only when the depth charges conceal the noise. This is a case of heightened mental acuity because of fear of death that makes heroes and survivors. We are slowly easing off the bottom. The depth charging continues. Inside the boat, the pressure and the temperature continue to rise. Suddenly, the sound of the destroyer approaches, and a line of 7 charges were being launched. And it alarmed all of us. These were so close, we could hear the click of the arming device before the explosion. We try not to jump or to move. It goes click, kapow, click, kapow. It does that 7 times. Click, kapow. head is splitting, your body aches, the boat is rolling, it actually rolling in the muck. Light bulbs implode. The squash on the hull, that steel hull, is so tremendous that incandescent light bulbs crushed and the glass came raining down all over the deck. The internal structure inside the hull, the plates are crushed and moved, and they shear the heads of the rivets off, and they're flying all over the place like bullets. The inside of the submarine is 2 inches of cork, and these things are going right through and hitting the hull. Sea valves are lifted off their seats, and salt water floods in and races across the deck to spill into the buildings. It is dark, like the darkness of a tomb. Unless you have been in the area of the fear of death, you have never experienced the odor of death. The aroma of the sweat from the fear of death is pungent and nauseous, extremely nauseous. That, with the sweat from temperature being 125 degrees or better, mixed with the salt water, mixed with the ever-present odor of diesel oil, and because of the moisture, the ozone created by all the electrical, switches and bus bars, it creates an aroma or an odor that wants you to vomit. The gorge just rises to your throat, and you can't do anything about it. You're lying on the deck. I was 20 years old at that time. I was one of the older men. The average age of the crew was 19. That means we had a whole bunch of 18-year-olds. I was older, I was higher ranked, I was a team leader. I'm supposed to be a role model. I laid on the deck and cried. It's total darkness. Now suddenly, our emergency DC powered light comes on, and that light is like maybe the dome light in your car. You know, it's very, not what you call bright, very dull, very dim. When that light came on, we could see again. And years of training and all the developed skills that we had took over. The fear of death is momentarily forgotten with the instant demand for action to save the boat. That's paramount. Very quietly and quickly, all measures were taken to solve the never-before-experienced problems. Not one command was given, and not one was required. We have been blowing negative tank now with 3,000-pound air each time a string of 7 charges were laid. I mentioned earlier that this was done to conceal the squeal of the high-pressure air passing through a small orifice that could be heard by the enemy. Now that they had passed over us and were working their way further north and further away, we slowly rocked the boat back and forth to ease our way free. We had sunk 9 more feet into the mud since we first hit bottom. Now loose, we started moving ever so slowly seaward. We are now, after 14 hours down with no air purification, very lethargic probably physically and mentally operating at 50% due to the lack of oxygen. The atmospheric pressures and temperature are rising. It's now 36 inches and 130 degrees, respectively. Everyone tries to continue lying down or remain totally motionless to slow your breathing rate, to slow your breathing rate and conserve oxygen. The sweat from heat and the sweat of fear continue. We had nothing to eat or drink. No one dare request permission to go to the bathroom. It's called the head. For fear of making a noise audible to the enemy. Hours later, we risked coming to the surface. We tried to put on more speed, get some fresh air, and assess our damages topside. We were up less than 15 minutes before shore-based planes found us and attacked. We dove to escape. During the short time we were on the surface, we saw what had happened. We had no radio. All the radio wires are down. All the insulators were broken. The superstructure was caved in as much as 6 to 8 inches between the ribs. The wooden deck was shattered. The 2-inch thick pressure glass on the gyro repeater on the bridge was crushed to dust. The biggest piece was no bigger than my thumb. We had only gotten 2 more miles further out to sea. The radar mast was jammed. Both periscopes were inoperative. The only thing that was still holding us together was that the pressure hull had maintained its integrity. We set up work teams. It took 2 weeks, working 24 hours a day on the surface and submerged on the surface. Whenever we could come up for a few minutes or hours at night when we could escape from the airplanes and the destroyers. It took, as I said, 2 weeks to repair the equipment, get some of the stuff operating, clean up the deck, get rid of all the broken glass and other debris, and to give the crew some rest and fresh air, etc. Recharge the batteries. Since the first night after the start of that battle, we were out of contact with COMSUB PAC, Commander of Submarines in the Pacific. We had not been able to receive new recognition signals. In today's language, you computer guys, they were out of the loop. Total. We had received 98 depth charges during the precise length of the strings of 7 charges, more than the previous 4 patrols combined, more than any other submarine received during World War II and lived to tell. At this point on the patrol, upwards of more than 150 depth charges. No one had been recovered. The sub in the sector to the north had heard the attack and the depth charges and reported the event to COMSUB PAC. After our not reporting in for over 2 weeks, we were listed as overdue and presumed lost. In World War II Navy talk, that means you were dead. We were later told that even Tokyo Rose got into the act and reported the mighty forces of the Imperial Navy of Japan has sunk another United States submarine that dared to attack our convoy off the coast of South Indochina near Cameron Bay. In my opening remarks, I said that I fear death no longer. You wonder why. Now you know why. The reason is, I have already experienced death. I have died. Tokyo Rose and United States Navy have both proclaimed my ransom. Thank you. I have a few interesting statistics, and then we have a few minutes we can have question and answer session. At the start of World War II, the USA population was 133.5 million. We had 16,353,000 people in the military. 14,478,700 in the Army, 1,875,000 in the Navy. Of that 16 million, 10 million were drafted from 1940 through 1946. The remaining 6 million plus were either already in the military, National Guard, or volunteers. USA had 292,131 military deaths, plus 115,185 due to POW losses, accidents, etc. Total of 407,000 plus, which equals 2.5% of the military, or 1 in every 40 men. At the end of the war, 30,000 men had volunteered for submarine duty. Only 16,000 actually went out on patrols or missions of the kind I just described to you. That is 1/10 of 1% of the total U.S. military, or only 0.8% of 1% of the Navy personnel. These 16,000 men spent a total of 70,838 days on patrol. That is more than 194 years, man years. They made 1,682 war patrols. We had 223 submarines. They made 4,873 naval attacks. 4,112 on merchantmen and 761 on men of war. We lost 52 submarines, 1 in every 4 at sea. We lost approximately 3,600, not approximately, we lost 3,617 submariners. That's over 23% of the 16,000, 1 in every 4.4 men. U.S. submarines sank 52% of all Japanese ships sunk by all Allied forces. That means the U.S., the British, the Netherlands, all. Our U.S. submarines killed or wounded 55 to 59% of all Jap casualties. Our U.S. submarines rescued 504 U.S. airmen shot down in enemy waters. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I can try to answer. Kevin.
How many men were on that submarine?
80.
How many torpedoes?
70. How many torpedoes?
Yeah.
24. We had 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft. In the forward torpedo room, we had 6 torpedoes in the tubes, 10 standing by, and aft we had 4, and 8. About 30, whatever the number is, I can't remember. But whatever it is. Yes, sir. Greg?
You said when the South Road passed right over top of you, then you're shooting at the freight behind the South Road?
The leading, the leading destroyer was probably 3 or 4 miles ahead of the tanker and the freighter. Yes, and so we just waited until he went by, and we were probably settled in at about maybe 100 feet, and periscope depth is 60 feet. So we rose up to periscope depth, raised the periscope up. It's now exposed maybe about maybe a foot out of the water. The captain made we had already determined that was going to happen, so we had set up our TDC, torpedo data computer, as to how we wanted the torpedoes fired. They have to travel 400 yards before they harden themselves, so we can't get any closer than that. So we try to shoot at 800 yards to 1,000. Okay, 1,000 is a half a mile. Okay. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Early in the war, we had a problem with defective torpedoes. We sent submarines out with all defective torpedoes. I assume that was solved by the time you were.
No, yes. Well, by the time this patrol, yes. Yeah, the powers that be during wartime, before the war, had determined that a torpedo is not designed to hit the vessel it sinks. It's designed to explode by magnetic reaction directly under a vessel. Here's the vessel, okay? Now, as soon as it gets a magnetic confrontation here, that torpedo explodes. It creates a hole in the water. That hole in the water, the keel of the ship cannot live in a vacuum. And so the keel of the ship breaks, and that's how the ship sinks. The magnetic arming devices did not work. We discovered also that if you hit the target dead on, the arming device did not go off. The best bet was to hit it a glancing blow. The skippers who were the most successful were the ones who almost missed. Okay? Anyone else? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I am hearing more and more that people who were in the Second World War rarely spoke about it once they got back home. So my question to you is, how much did your family know about what you had been through, and how long have you been doing this kind of talk?
And the last portion, how long have I been giving this talk? 8 months.
8 months. But in the intervening years,
If they asked me, I told them.
but you didn't go out and...
No.
Do you know why? I mean, this is not an unusual thing among World War II veterans, that they did not speak about their experiences.
Even right now, it's too emotional to talk about. That's very, very difficult. Yes.
Could you tell us a little about your training you went through and how that was to get you through the training, because it
yeah. Well, I went to my training was boot camp, signalman school, submarine school, night vision school, watermaster school, advanced submarine school, advanced quartermaster school, and then I got on the boat. Okay? Then your training starts. All the rest of that is just knowledge and the determination by the people who are your instructors that you have the physical and psychological makeup to qualify as a submarine person. And then, before you go on patrol, you're on this boat, you practice 2 weeks every day, diving, surfacing, attack, collision, battle stations. You know, every guy on that boat had at least 4 jobs. You have to learn them all. And in addition to knowing those 4 jobs, you have to know every job that every other person on that boat does. Because you never know where you're going to be on that submarine when that thing goes out, and that ship starts going down. And it makes 100 feet in 17 seconds. Okay? And you don't know where you're going to be. Yeah, Tony.
You refer to the submarine as a boat, and most people want to call a larger boat a ship.
Yeah, all submarines are boats.
Okay.
U-boat. Or a DOS boat. Yes, sir. Okay, we're going to take a 10... Oh, I'm sorry. Hey, Ed.
So how long would you be on the ship? There are 8 men on the boat at a time. How long before you touch dry land?
Okay.
Like normal.
There's 2 limitations. 3. There are 3 things. Okay? 1, how many torpedoes you shot, how much food you got, and how much fuel you got.
You wouldn't come back.
You wouldn't come back until either you ran out of food, fuel, or torpedoes.
Should have shot more at time.
Yeah. Then the captain might be criticized. Also, the captains, you know, were relieved of command if they were not bold enough. Yes, sir.
Any officer related to
No, it just happened. I know what you're thinking. Yes, we have Charlie Lockwood in Pearl Harbor as admiral of. No, they were not related. It just happened that my commanding officer was named Ralph Lockwood. The highest ranking award for the military is the Congressional Medal of Honor. That medal is worn on a ribbon around the recipient's neck. All other awards are worn on your uniform in descending order of achievement, from top to bottom and from right to left. There are a large number of medals that are awarded for valor or for other acts of heroism and dedication to duty, such as the Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Medal, Letter of Commendation. But above all of these, except the Medal of Honor, the submarine qualification medal is worn. These are called your dolphins. They're extremely difficult to achieve. You have to take written exams, oral exams, and it can take from months up to a year to prepare and to complete these exams. Less than 1 in 1,000 men in World War II received this award. Next is my submarine combat pin, the stars. It's awarded for completion of successful patrols or missions. Next, is a Navy combat pin. These 3 medals are World War II victory, North American defense, Asiatic Pacific. This is the Philippine Liberation Medal with Bronze Star and the Philippine Unit Citation Award frame. The fleet-type World War II submarine was 312 feet, 9 3/4 inches long. It's 27 feet wide. With a periscope raised about 2 feet out of the water, the keel, or the bottom of the boat, was at 66 feet. Usually on the surface, our draft was about 15 feet, but we could make it somewhat less or a great deal more, depending on how much of our hull line we wanted to expose in any combat condition. If we wanted to remain as deep as we could so that they couldn't see us, we could sink ourselves down wherever we wanted. Or if we wanted to get up high and be able to make some greater speeds, we would just blow ourselves up out of the water and just skim the top. One interesting thing is that when we would be on the surface at night, and we would charge our batteries, and we would get, and before we would dive in the morning, we would bring the boat down low so that the flying fish would fly up and land on the deck. You know, flying fish, I don't know, it's a great delicacy. And our captain liked 2 or 3 of those cooked every morning for his breakfast. And we always tried to do that because it's good to keep the boss happy. If we were on the surface, we could make, 22 mile an hour, 23 mile an hour. If we're submerged, we could make about 10 miles an hour for short periods, but usually we travel about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and we can do that all day. At 100 feet, there's a pressure of 44 pounds per square inch on the pressure hull. That means that if we were at, say, 300 feet, every square inch of that hull had a pressure of whatever 3 times 44 is, 132, whatever, pounds. The same thing as if you were sunk and you had to escape from 100 feet down. Before you could enter the water, you had to subject your body to 44 pounds of pressure per square inch. The normal pressure is 7 pounds, which is 1 atmospheric pressure. 1 G they call it. And somebody asked me about training. That was some of the things we had to do. I went down to diving bells and in a bathing suit with a Momsen going on so I could breathe. And when I escaped, I practiced escapes from 100 feet down. There are 3 states of buoyancy. Positive means you float. Your mass in the water that is displaced is more than what that water weighs. If you have negative, you sink. You displace less weight of water than what you weighed, so you sink. And if those 2 are equal, you have a state of buoyancy, and you can remain at an even depth with very little outside control to maintain that depth. Although if you were slightly off, you could maintain your depth by adjusting your bow planes or your speed in the water as to how you can maintain the depth of water that you want to remain at. There are 7 main ballast tanks. 4 of them held diesel oil, and the other were used for water. All of these were outside the pressure hull, open to the sea at the bottom, and therefore not subject to depth pressures. There are many other vital large tanks, valve buoyancy, safety, negative. All of these are blown with 3,000-pound air, which I mentioned earlier. There were 3 trim tanks, 2 freshwater tanks, 2 sanitary tanks. There are 5 air systems, 3,000-pound air, 600, 200, 110 pound. There are more electrical systems than I could possibly name, both AC and DC. Hydraulic systems for the bound stern planes, for the helm position, for the sound heads and other large equipment. Air purification systems, salt and freshwater systems, air induction, engine starting and stopping, fuel systems, cooling systems for the machinery. And everybody who was awarded their dolphins had to make schematic drawings of every one of these systems. Had to have a hands-on and locate, identify, and operate every switch, valve, and device for each compartment leader, each division officer, and the executive officer before being certified that you are able to perform all of these jobs at any location or any position aboard a submarine. There are 10 main compartments. I mentioned some of them earlier. Starting at the bow, it's the forward torpedo room. It has 6 torpedo tubes. 6 torpedoes in the tubes, 10 in storage. Has high-pressure air bottle banks, torpedo alcohol tanks, 2B and 2C sound heads, and an escape hatch. And after that is the forward battery. It's the officers' quarters. Includes the wardroom and the small galley, the captain's quarters, beds for 6 of the 8 officers, bunks for 5 of 7 of the chiefs, and 126 batteries. Each battery is about, stand up here. Each battery is about that big. Weighs, a little bit more than you know, it's 1,000 pounds. The control room had the Christmas tree, which maybe you've seen in some of the movies, that indicates the status of every opening to sea. It's green, that means it's safe to dive. It's red, that means it's not safe to dive. You've got to close that valve, or otherwise you're going to take on seawater. Has the bow and stern plane controls, depth gauges, gyro compass, air bank controls, electrical controls, auxiliary helm, radio shack, alarm controls, battle stations, collision, diving or surfacing. Has a trim manifold, IFF apparatus. I'll mention that later. IFF stands for identification fender fold. And the pump room, where there were all kinds of machinery, basically for compressing air. And the conning tower, which was located directly above the control room. You had the hatch to the bridge and the hatch to the control room. It had a helm with the engine annunciators, communication systems, 1MC, 7MC. These were used for the communication to all the hands. One was the captain's link. He would talk often to the entire crew. He would tell everybody what was going to happen, where we were, what we were going to do, and, stay alert. Listen to what I tell you. Had a QB to QC sonar controls, the JK sound controls, had radar screens, plotting table, torpedo data computer, the torpedo flaring switches, collision alarms, and in the after battery was the main galley and the crew's mess. Ammunition locker, freezers, 126 batteries, another 126,000 pounds. 36 bunks for 40 men, 2 heads, that means 2 toilets. We had 3 toilets, 14. That's why we didn't have any room. Did I hear anybody laugh? Hiss. 1 shower stall, 2 wash basins, air purification and an airlock to the engine room. Then there's the forward engine room. There was 2 1,600 brake horsepower diesel engines directly connected to 2 generators, 2 Kleinschmidt water evaporators, main induction control, and in the after engine room we had 2 more engines like that connected to generators, plus a 3rd diesel 800 horsepower. In the maneuvering room, that was all the electrical controls. There was a huge electrical cubicle and bus bars in there like this. Copper. Engine and motor controls, the 4 main motors, 2 reduction gearboxes, the engine answering annunciators, lighting motor generators, shafts, and twin screws aft. And in the after torpedo room, there was 4 tubes facing aft, 4 torpedoes in each tube, 1 in each tube, 6 torpedoes in the racks, 8 bunks for 10 men, air vents, alcohol storage, and we call that the music room. Because the chief of that particular department liked to have music every evening, and I had my clarinet with me, the guitar, harmonica, banjo, and we used to have a little music session at night when we were on the battle stations or doing something else. And so that's obviously where my home was at, because I had my clarinet with me. Without that, I was sleeping over there, sharing a sack with someone else. I think I mentioned earlier on that U.S. submarines rescued 504 airmen, some Navy, most of them were in the Army. There are several ways that this occurred. Occasionally, just by accident. We sighted a life raft or a man in a life jacket while traveling to and from our patrol station. But most of the time, however, the rescue mission was your assigned job. You operated in an area between the Japanese bombing targets and the home base of the aircraft as a lifeguard to pick up any of our men in trouble. Usually subs and planes do not get along. At the sight of an airplane, no matter whose or what kind of a airplane, a sub dives to escape, to hide. We learned that lesson the hard way. If you remember, I told you about this one Army pilot who sank a submarine coming into base and said, "Snake." I was bombed more times by American airplanes than by Japanese airplanes. I stopped in my last message, but when we finally got the boat fixed and were able to move on and escape. But at that time, we were able to contact ComSubNet. And after much discussion, because they didn't believe us, remember, they had been told that we were lost, dead, sunk. And discussion with them and checking. You know, I'm not privy to this, but they probably asked the captain what his mother's maiden name was. You know, that old question, okay? And they didn't want to believe because they thought we had been captured. But we received a set of alternate recognition signals. And we were guaranteed a safety lane to use for entrance into Subic Bay. Subic Bay is in the Philippines, and at this time, the war had moved north, and they had moved the submarine tenders further north, so that they reduced. Remember I said we had to go several thousand miles from Australia to get to a point where we were even in what we would consider battle area. Now we were much closer. We were within 100 miles. So we had a safety lane that we could go into Subic Bay. While we were in that lane, we spotted a plane. Oh, it was about 10 miles out. Really low. It was just sort of there, coming in our direction. And so, I told you I went to signal school. I learned how to send light messages, you know. That's my job. I up there. Do the signals, you know. And back comes a whole bunch of light captains. What did he say? I said, Captain, nothing. It didn't make any sense. I said, do it again. All right, do this again. Back comes the jump. You know. He's given we all learned it. Give him the second. Okay. By this time, he's about 3 miles out. 3 miles in that area is like a minute or less, you know. And we still had not. I told the captain, I said, that is not one of our airplanes. He is not responding. The captain says, we're in the safety lane. And all that. That plane went right over the top of it. It had big orange balls all over that thing. We dove and, you know, he said, clear the deck, look out below, you know, and we crashed and slammed the door, the hatch, and we got down to about 100 feet, and that plane would turn around and came back about 3,000 miles. Pushed us down to about 300 feet before we got control over it again. Never trust an airplane. Like I said before, even though we had two 20-millimeter anti-aircraft guns, and we had all kinds of 50 caliber and all this kind of stuff, we never shot at an airplane. We saw an airplane except in this one instance. We dove and got out of there. Okay, following we finally got into Subic Bay, and they repaired us. That's what they were able. We got one periscope to work. We got the radio really fixed up good with good insulators that we didn't have proper insulators on before. You know, these are very, very high voltage. These cables, you know, I don't know, there's like 10,000 volts or something that we're able to send these messages halfway around the world. Huge voltage. We got the boat pretty well fixed up, and so they sent us out on a mission to the same place where we had just been in trouble before. You know, nobody liked that. We weren't really very happy about going back there, but we had to because they were running bombing missions out of Clark Field in the Philippines over to the Saigon and north other cities up that way, and also because that's just a short range across there, they would go out and look for convicts. So anyway, we went back out there, and we were going to set up a lifeguard mission on the coast of French Indochina. And when we got there, we see two little dinky 5,000-ton dirty-looking AK transports only a few hundred yards offshore. These are, you know, not very big vessels, and they can keep it short. They had 7 escorts. 2 ships, 7 escorts. And in other situations where we had 2 ships and they had 3. This is something crazy, you know. This is strange. There were 5 large destroyers, 2 sub-chasers protecting 2 small transports. And every even though they did not know we were there, they dropped the depth charge. They were just making sure that nobody was around. And we decided that, this is ridiculous. We have to know this is not common sense to go into attack nobody. So we backed off. And we called back and we told the people in the Philippines at Subic Bay, that, actually we got a hold of Concept back, and then they relayed the message that we had found this quote-unquote convoy, sent some airplanes out to bomb them. So the following day, we were told that they had a bunch of planes to come out and look for that convoy from the Philippines. They were B-25s. They call themselves Flaming Youth in the 15 Monsters or something like this. I don't know why they needed 16 planes to sink 2 ships, but I don't really know what the Army does. Anyway, they couldn't even find them. They'd slipped into a harbor somewhere and they couldn't find them. So they went over to Canaveral Bay, which is a Japanese base, and they dumped all their bombs there, and then they come flying back out again, and one of them gets shot at. The rest of them go back over the Philippines. This one guy has got one engine, and he's up there around, we're in communication with him. The seas were 15 feet high. It was just a very, very bad day. And after a lot of, if they had parachuted out, we'd never find them. We'd never find them. One would be here, one would be over there. We'd never. So they finally agreed they would try to ditch this thing near our fantail, the rear end of our submarine. Well, they came down, and a big wave came up and hit the front of that plane and just blew it into pieces. So we were close, and we, after maybe about 3 hours, we were able to find, there was six men in that plane. We found 5 of them. The pilot and co-pilot were really bad. They had smashed their heads when they were waving. They hit the control panels and got injured quite severely. We hauled them aboard and patched them up. We hauled these other guys aboard, and we spent the rest of that day and that night out there, no more than 15, 20 miles off the coast of South Indochina, now known as Vietnam, with our searchlight on, and we would yell out, and we'd be real quiet. Never heard a word. And we searched for them the next day, and we never found them. And so at this time, we're in great jeopardy. We're placing ourselves in extreme jeopardy. We could be attacked and be severely injured ourselves. So at this point, we broke off trying to find this guy, and we patched these guys up. And they were with us for a couple of weeks, and that gets pretty old hat because they were given good bunks to sleep in, and our guys had a hot sack somewhere else, and tempers start to go a little bit here, a little bit there. And finally, we got word that okay, you guys are beat up bad. Why don't you head up the coast to Hainan Island and the Batfish, which is another sub that's up there, and we can transfer people. We have like a rubber raft, and it's in the superstructure. We can pull that out and blow it up and dump it in the water, put a line on it, and we can throw a cable across the other guy. And we can haul these people back and forth, you know. So we got rid of these guys, and they were happy. They were going to go back to a hospital ship in Subic Bay. They were happy they were going back to a hospital ship and get off the submarine. They didn't like it too much. So then we went north to Hainan and then into the Straits of Formosa, across the top of the Philippines, past Okinawa, and then down to Saipan. This was now 2 typhoons later. I didn't even mention, but we went through 2 typhoons out there, in which many of our people got really badly injured. We almost lost one guy, went over the side of it. He wrapped himself up in the cables and finally caught him. And of course, when that typhoon, you maybe heard about, hit Okinawa and did a tremendous amount of damage. It did more damage to the ships in Okinawa than the kamikaze planes did. That's how severe these storms are. Went down past Okinawa, down to Saipan. We loaded up on fuel at Saipan and headed straight for San Francisco. We got back to San Francisco, and I had 35 days leave, and that's when my wife and I decided that maybe we were going to get together. We were married a couple years after that. Later, we learned that 3 of our subs attacked the convoy that I spoke about, 2 ships with 7 escorts, that had grown now to 10 escorts. Obviously, the Japanese were giving up. They were making a run back to the homeland, home islands. This was in, this was March of 1945. About then was when they had the air raids on Tokyo by the B-25 or whatever it was bombers that actually did more damage than the dropping of the 2 bombs, the 2 atomic bombs. But these subs made several approaches and attacks on the convoy, and they finally sank 1 destroyer and 1 transport. And they got beat up so bad that they quit. That was pretty bad. That shows you that at various times in the war, how things can change. The USS Suwannee SS-362 rescued 17 of the 504 airmen that the U.S. submarines saved during World War II. Although this may not sound like a very large number, the Bashaw, and later on the Tenosa, did not rescue any airmen. So you see, it's just a quirk of luck, or whether that happened to be the mission assigned to you at that time. I would like now to show a short video of the presentation of a dedication ceremony in Groton, Connecticut, of the Wall of Honor for the 3,617 submarine men that were lost in World War II. Thank you. presentation for the day. I thank you all for coming and listening.